Let's bring Dr. Mark Griffiths to the stage. Good morning, Mark.
Hi there, Sonia.
Great to have you. God, that's a really clear line. Wonderful. We love that. You are a professor of behavioural addiction at Nottingham Trent University. I was caught a bus from outside there recently. Actually, I was at an event. Very interesting work that you're engaged in, Mark. You study non-substance addiction. We've done that for over 35 years, including addictions to sexual behavior, which is exactly why, presumably, you've written this book. Okay, sexual perversions and paraphilias and A to Z. And Mark, I honestly, I'm literally not blowing smoke at your behind, but it's one of the most fascinating books. I was sent a PDF of an outline and a breakdown of the topics. It's one of the most fascinating books that I've seen in a long while, because I think the important thing about it and the interesting thing about it is you are discussing a lot of stuff that people out there are discussing, but they have no idea necessarily about it and what it all means from an academic perspective, but you do it in a very accessible way. So, Mark, tell us about your work studying non-substance addiction. Why do you do that?
Okay, well, I started my PhD way back in the middle of the 1980s on slot machine addiction. And then I kind of graduated in 1989 onto video game addiction. And then in 1995, I became the very first person, well, actually 1996, became the very first person ever to publish a paper on internet addiction. And then I went on to things like work addiction, sex addiction, exercise addiction, social media addiction, basically any addiction, well, any behaviors that don't involve the drugs.
Right.
I've almost certainly have published papers on it. I mean, people say I'm addicted to publishing papers, which if I am, it's the best addiction that you can have in academia. But I've always been interested in sexual behavior, and I suppose a lot of people are interested in sexual behavior, but I've always been interested in it from a more scientific side. But actually, and in my book, I do actually say that my interest started when I was about 13 years old, and I was totally obsessed with Adam and the Ants.
Me too.
Oh well, and I still love Adam Ant now. He's still one of my heroes. But he's secret. I mean, when he first started out in kind of 1977, lots of the songs that he was writing were actually about sexual paraphilias and what people would call sexual perversions and sexual deviations. But of course, when he became very popular and he was doing lots of, he was, doing songs like Ant Music and Prince Charming and Stand and Deliver, on every B-side, on the record, and I do mean every single B-side, was a song about a paraphilia. Now, whether it was voyeurism or whether it was sadomasochism or whether it was transvestism, honestly, every single B-side was related to a sexual behavior. And I actually later wrote an article about all of his songs. I mean, he's written more songs about sexual perversions and paraphilias than anybody. But then when I went to university and I did psychology, mainly because I'd done maths, physics, chemistry and biology at A-level. I thought I want to get away from science. But in fact, when I started doing psychology, it was biology, it was neurobiology, it was statistics, methodology. It was actually really hard science. But there was a lecturer who was a guest lecturer that came to my university in 1986. And to this day, it was still the very best lecture I'd ever heard.
Wow.
It's from a psychiatrist called Dr. Alec Oswald. I have no idea if he's still with us or not. And I was absolutely amazed that this was somebody who his whole professional career was treating people who had various sexual deviations or perversions or paraphilias. And I think that was probably the first time I'd even heard the word paraphilia in that particular lecture. And I was just totally transfixed by it. And when I started lecturing, I mean, I was very young. I finished my PhD at 23, went straight into lecturing.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was very, very young at the time. And that's why I've been in this area nearly 40 years now. And
Got you.
People can't believe how long I've been in the field. And it is because I actually started very, very early. But the thing was, I was very lucky when I started my first job at the University of Plymouth. They gave me a course to do on addictions. And at that point, all the addictions I covered were traditional drug addictions. And I just had one lecture on gambling addiction. But over the next 35 years or so, I introduced more and more, non-substance addictions into my lectures, including sex addiction. Okay, and again, in fact, when I went to Nottingham Trent University, not only did they let me do a whole course on addictive behaviours, they also let me do a whole course on sexual behaviour. And that was where I then was managed to kind of start reading other people's work about various aspects of sexual behavior, including paraphilias. And then in fact, I mean, I'd never actually researched in this area, and I actually then started writing. There was a magazine called Bizarre, and I don't know if that is still going. I mean, I used to buy it in W.H. Smith's. It was a monthly magazine, and I started writing for them. So I wrote my first article I wrote for them was 10 bizarre autoerotic deaths, particularly to do with what we call hypoxophilia, people who are sexually aroused by restricting oxygen supply to the brain.
Ooh.
Okay. And then I wrote another article on apotemnophilia, which was people who are sexually attracted to amputees. So I was doing lots of populist writing, but it actually wasn't until 2012 that I actually wrote my first academic paper on paraphilias. And actually that very first paper was actually about how the internet had made it much easier for people like me to actually research paraphilic behaviors, because it's amazing how you can go out on the internet and find, if you've got a particular sexual interest, there's almost certainly an online group out there that actually, however bizarre or extreme it might be, there's usually an online group out there. And that's how I started collecting data, was through the internet. And it actually, where this all sprang from, and you said about my book, I actually didn't write my book. Now that sounds bizarre, because my book is actually an edited collection of the many blogs that I've written over the years, and it was actually edited by my good friend Dr Mike Sutton. We were sitting in the pub one night, and he said, you should put all these things into a book. So in fact, Mike did all the heavy lifting here. He took 10 years worth of kind of populist articles I'd written on lots of different strange and unusual and what some people might say are bizarre sexual behaviors, and put it all into the book. And that's the book that's just come out. But also, by writing my blog, what amazed me is, if you go to my blog and you look at the comments underneath some of this, is that, the one example I'll give you, and I hope this isn't too bad for this time in the morning, but I wrote a blog on people who are sexually attracted to flatulence. Okay. Now I thought this was a hypothetical type of paraphilia. So I wrote a blog on it, and what amazed me, the number of people said, I can't believe somebody is actually writing about this from a scientific perspective. And then I actually then in 2013, I published the very first case study of an aproctophile. And this went worldwide. If you type my name, Mark Griffiths, and aproctophilia into Google, you come up with hundreds of news stories. It just went ballistic.
We have so many questions. We have so many questions. First of all, everybody, I have been trying to get Mark's name on the screen. It's Dr. Mark Griffiths, because they say, what's his name? What's his name? Right. So many questions. So many questions. I love this chat already, says Soul Sound. I know, it's mad, isn't it? Absolutely bonkers. So here's the thing. Let me just, where do I start? So first of all, 1996, you were already writing about addictions to the internet. You were well ahead of your game. What were you discovering then about it?
Well, obviously, I mean, it's bizarre actually, Sonia. In 1995, I gave a talk at the British Psychological Society conference about something I called technological addictions. And I was actually talking about my work on video game addiction and slot machine addiction, and a bit on television addiction. And somebody asked me, said, have you ever heard of this thing called the internet? And I said, well, actually, I have. And it was only about a month or so before I'd heard of this thing called the internet.
Right.
And I was on an academic kind of discussion group with other academics. And, people were telling me that there were some people who were spending all their time online. They were getting emotional attachments to people they'd never even met, talking away. And this was all to do with typing away with other people that lived in other countries. And I mentioned this in the press conference I gave after this paper, and the next day all the papers, it would go, professor says internet will destroy your marriage. I mean, they were all sensationalist kind of articles. But then as a result of that, the Times Higher Education supplement, as it was called then, said, we saw all the press coverage you got, would you like to write us a 2,000 word piece on internet addiction? So I wrote a very populist piece. But then I used that to get some small grants to actually research whether people could be genuinely addicted to the internet. Now, I ought to say, now I've come to the position that people are no more addicted to the internet than alcoholics are addicted to bottles, because it's not the internet you're addicted to. It's the things you do on the internet. And so obviously my research then And it was actually in 2000 and 2001, I published my first papers looking at excessive sexual behavior on the internet. And so, so my research says is that a small minority of people do seem to develop addictions on the internet. And I've got a very specific definition of what I mean by addiction. And now I've applied my model of addiction to many, many different types of behavior, including things like social media and other things.
Is there a common, not including substances, but when it comes to non-substance addictions, is there a common theme that kind of links addictions?
Well, yeah, for me, when I talk about addiction, I'm talking about a behavior that completely takes over that person's life. They do it to neglect of everything else. They get genuine withdrawal symptoms, even for people who've got behavioral addictions. They will have increased moodiness, increased irritability, increased frustration, but also on a physiological level, stomach cramps, nausea, hand sweats. You get that in addicted gamblers, addicted video game players who can't engage in their behavior. So there are lots, and that's what I look for. I look for commonalities. But we've got to remember is that every addiction is different. There are quite clearly differences between social media addiction and gambling addiction and heroin addiction. And when I use the word addiction, I am using it in exactly the same way that people use to describe drugs. And the good news is, by my definitions, very few people are genuinely addicted to things like video games or social media.
Oh, that's curious. If there's very few, that means we could help them, be more effective in helping them, right? Because there's a suggestion there that we're almost kind of mischaracterizing what these addicts are. Is that kind of what you're saying?
The thing is, people use the word addiction. The number of people say, "Oh, that TV program, it's addictive watching. This book is addictive reading."
They use it easily, right?
That kind of really positive, engrossing. You're losing yourself. That, to me, there's elements of addiction there, but that's not addiction in and of itself.
It's difficult. It's different than having to watch it constantly, repeatedly. It would be, that's different, right? There's a distinction.
Oh, absolutely.
There.
And there's obviously a lot. I mean, I've done research now on binge watching. We now get people who sit down and watch Netflix again and again and again. And I love a bit of binge watching. It's great. But it is one of those things that, you can lose sleep over it. You lack of productivity at work. But again, for me, these people are not necessarily, very unlikely to be addicted by my criteria, but quite clearly it's something that can have negative effects on people's lives. So it might be a problematic behavior without necessarily being an addictive behavior.
Curious. Some people have only just right now discovered the word paraphilias, and it's a very simple. My understanding of it, it's about, in fact, I'm taking it from your description. Paraphilias from the Greek, beyond usual or typical love, are uncommon types of sexual expression, often more commonly described as sexual deviations, sexual perversions, or disorders of sexual preference. Which brings me to one of our questions in the comments. Actually, Callum, who's just joined us from the US, Callum said, can you ask him which of the strange sexual ones interested him the most? And I'm not sexually interested in him, by the way. Callum felt the need to point that out for some reason. So which ones interested you the most, Mark?
Well, I say when I come across, when people talk, it's not that they necessarily interest me. I just find the kind of seriously, you can't be serious. So, I've got sections in my book on hemorrhoid fetishes, or I've got stuff on people who are sexually aroused by people who are crying. So that one on crying actually does academically interest. I've now actually written 4 scientific papers on what we call dacrophilia, people who are sexually attracted to people who cry. Now, one of the papers we published, Sonia, and this is, I think, it's really interesting. We interviewed 8 people, mainly from an online forum called the Crying Forum, but we also got a few off a website called FetLife, which looks at various fetishistic behaviors. But anyway, even amongst these 8 dacrophiles, we found 3 completely different types of dacrophile. We had what was called a compassionate dacrophile, people who were sexually attracted to people who were showing the more compassionate side of themselves. And actually, these were women, these were mainly women. Now, it's interesting because most paraphilias are very male dominated. But the paper that I did on dacrophilia showed we actually had more females than males that were being interviewed. We also had what we called the kind of dominant dacrophiles. And these are people who they're usually sadomasochists, and they actually get their sexual pleasure from making somebody cry. And then bizarrely, we had one dacrophile who was, believe it or not, we called him a curled lip dacrophile. And this was somebody who got very sexually attracted when people are just about to cry and the bottom lip starts wobbling, and they were just sexually attracted to the bottom lip wobbling. And in fact, they'd gone through films and, you know, actually video recorded little clips of people just about to cry, and that was what made them, that was their sexual attraction. So the thing is, what's bizarre, and you know, I'm using the bizarre in the most general word here, is that people can develop a sexual preference for almost anything that you can think of, you know, whether it's a particular body part or it's a particular substance. There'll be somebody out there that has a sexual preference for this. So the question, what's the most interesting one? The most interesting one is always reading one that I've never heard of, because when you know, the things I write about, to me, they're almost like, you know, what people would describe as vanilla now. So when I talk about things like zoophilia or sadomasochism, to me, because they're so mainstream now.
Oh, vanilla. That's like a normalization, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that is the thing that I find fascinating about your books. There's all these words that I had no clue of before. And I have to say, when I started to go down them, I found them extraordinary. There's like burping fetishes, right? People are aroused by people burping. And people are also aroused by the sexual nature of squeezing spots. That's called
acnophilia.
Acnophilia.
Yeah, can I just say, acnophilia is a made-up word. It's out there on the internet. That most genuine paraphilias have a Greek prefix followed by philia. Acnophilia is a completely made-up. You know, obviously, I've reported what's out there. There are no academic papers on acnophilia, but I can tell you now the number of squeezing spots websites there are. I mean, you type in, you know, and in fact, I think there's something called Dr. Pimple Popper. There's actually a whole program that's dedicated to squeezing spots. But there are some people who are sexually attracted to, you know, basic pus from acne, which is bizarre. And in fact, almost, you know, that people that are sexually attracted to earwax, pus, blood. I mean, you name it, any substance that come out of
extraordinary.
I know. And
you've got, honestly, like, we always have a busy live stream chat, right? But people are literally like, cannot believe what they're hearing. I mean, cannot believe what they're hearing. Let me read you some of these comments. Okay. And no, Callum, your section was not boring before this. Your section was also brilliant, but completely different. Short Order Cook asks, could you ask, did he find out how these were developed? Is there a common overarching denominator?
Well, I say most paraphilias, you take the Greek word for whatever the behavior or object it is, and you add word philia, which is Greek for love, at the end of it. So in fact, I've actually in my book, because I found things that haven't been cited in the academic literature. So I've got glossophilia, which is people who are sexually attracted to tongues. I've got there's something called fridophilia. I mean, luckily, I worked with somebody in my department who's Greek. So I used to go to her and say, what's the Greek for this word? And fridophilia is people who are sexually attracted to eyebrows. So that's how when I've invented these new paraphilias based on people who are sexually attracted to things that say that most people would find unusual. The way you normally do it is to say you've got the Greek prefix and then philia. The other way that people often, if you're out there online, is that there are lots of words for phobias. Okay, and in fact, some people then just flip phobia to philia. So there are lots of paraphilias out there that, you know. So I'm trying to think of one. I think there's one called climacophilia, which is, I think it's the sexual attraction from falling downstairs, but it actually comes from climacophobia. So it's the fear of falling downstairs. I mean, I hope I'm right. I mean, maybe I've got that wrong. I've not got an encyclopedic brain and can remember every single philia. But what I'm saying to you is that some people, I say there's two ways of, that names get formed. Greek suffix followed by philia, or you take a particular phobia and you switch the word phobia to philia and it suddenly becomes a paraphilia. And that's why, again, if you type A to Z of paraphilias into the internet, it comes up with lists, 1,000-word long lists. But in fact, most of these things are just, they're not real paraphilias. They are phobias that have just been transposed. And in fact, my book, it's called An A to Z, not The A to Z. okay, because there's lots of things that I didn't write about him. But my book.
Exactly, which brings me to my next point, and I found it very interesting. I think you might know what I'm going to say, and that is I found it very curious that you didn't give paedophilia its own category, and I know that it's included in others. Tell us more about that.
Well, the thing about paedophilia is there are just whole libraries on paedophilia. And yeah, there is various references to paedophilia through the book in relation to other types of paraphilia. But the thing is trying to condense it down into 1 or 2 pages. I didn't think I could ever do it justice. There's so much research on paedophilia, whereas most of the stuff that I looked at in my book, there's either no research or there's a few isolated case studies, and that's what I wanted to concentrate on, is the things that people don't know about rather than the things that people do know about. I mean, obviously, paedophilia, it's a horrific crime. But as I say, there are just libraries of stuff out there. So I did mention in my
I actually think it was a good shout, to be honest with you. I think it was a good shout because I think it could have distracted from it. And because I think the book as it stands is actually something that people could actually give as a Christmas gift, right?
Well, it is. And the whole point about this book is you don't have to start at the beginning. You just can dip in anywhere, and each entry is a standalone entry. I mean, occasionally I will say earlier in the book I mentioned this, but really you don't have to read it from start to finish.
No, you can literally dip in at any point, can't you? And that's interesting. And also, I thought I just see the mention of autogynephilia in the comments, a topic that I'm very interested in. I interviewed Ray Blanchard. And also, obviously, that's now gone kind of like global because Joe Rogan interviewed JD Vance and talked about autogynephilia. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, again, as I say, the idea of kind of having a sexual attraction to somebody who has changed their gender is becoming, like I say, it's become more mainstream. I can't remember it now. I mean, the program I watched, there was I think it's called Sexy Dirty Millions. It was Donald Sutherland, and there's a character in that. One of the Baldwin brothers has actually got a relationship with somebody who is transgender in that. And that, when things like that become more mainstream, as I say, it kind of almost becomes vanilla because it becomes normalized.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Because the idea that like zoophilia, for example, is becoming normalized and vanilla is really alarming. I've got to ask you some more questions. Mark, I hope you're up for more questions.
Okay, yeah, go.
You've literally set the cat amongst the pigeons here. People cannot believe what they're hearing, right? This is interesting. Is a paraphilia different to a perversion? Asked Jan.
It depends. Like with all these things, we have to go what's called an operational definition. I mean, I've defined paraphilia in the book, and I've basically taken it from what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The thing about perversion, I mean, some people, I did wonder whether I should have the word perversion on the front because people do find it a stigmatizing word. But I mean, if you look at the origins of the word perversion, we're talking about something that's kind of away from the norm, okay? And that's what I'm really talking about here. And, can I also say my book does not pathologize any of these behaviors because most of the behaviors I'm talking about are what I would call non-normative sexual behaviors. And, most of these behaviors between consenting adults, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them as well. And in that sense, there's nothing perverted about them because if you've got two or more people that enjoy this particular sexual preference, that doesn't make it a perversion. But the point is, I think most people, I mean, there'll be some things that people will read in the book and that, they will get that ick factor thinking, oh, that's horrible or
There's
whatever.
quite a lot of ick going on for me, but that in itself is a curiosity. So what you're really saying is as long as it's like decent and safe, we shouldn't be kink shaming people as long as it's consensual. But I get that. I absolutely get that. So, and also Soul Dad said, what are the root causes of paraphilias? Well, that's a good one. Coming from a psychological perspective, what do you think?
Okay, for me, and I know there'll be other psychologists out there that don't agree with me, but particularly from the research that I've done on things like aproctophilia and dacryphilia, most people talk about, and it's usually things that are formed early in childhood, and it's what we call, well, I think most people out there might have heard something called classical conditioning. So this is Pavlov's dogs ringing the bell. So this is the idea that the dogs learnt that when the bell rang, it was dinner time, and eventually, what happens over the long run is that the dogs basically become classically conditioned to the bell. The bell means food. This, I think, happens with a lot of sexual behaviors, that early in your, childhood or adolescence, is that you have what we call associative pairing, is that things that are, not sexual at all are basically paired with things that are sexual. And over time, so I can think of one particular case that I don't think it's in my book, but it talks, well, actually, no, I think it was to do with wedding ring fetishes, and people, there's a guy that basically, when he sat on his babysitter's lap, he used to twiddle her ring on her finger. Now, at that young age, he didn't realize, he felt this is a really lovely feeling. And, basically it became that rings became something that was related with sex. It got to a point, actually, he could not make love to his wife unless he was twiddling her ring. So, so I think a lot of, so I'll go back to the one on a proctophilia, people who are sexually attracted to flatulence. The guy I interviewed, called Brad, he was an American, and he said that it all started for him when he was in class when he was about 10 years old, and he was totally besotted by a girl that was in one of the classes. And he wasn't in the class at the time, but he'd heard that this girl who he really fancied had actually farted in front of the rest of the class. Okay. And he said, obviously, he knew biologically that girls farted, but he hadn't really made that connection. And in his head, the idea that farting and the fact I fancied, this became paired in his head. So this is this associative pairing. Then, when he was actually in his teens, he got to a point where he realized that actually hearing somebody fart was actually sexually attracted to him. Basically, Brad told me that he actually made bets with his friend, bets that he would lose. And the losing part of the bet is that a person could fart on him, literally come up to him and fart in his face. He actually made that part. I mean, obviously, the other person didn't realize this was sexual, but this was actually sexual to him. But it's all to do with the pairing of what are sexual experiences for the person with something, an object, a behavior that some people don't see as particularly sexual. I think a lot of paraphilias are rooted in this classically conditioned process.
So they could be multitudinous then, because we all have individual differences, and whatever impacts you in a certain way is going to impact me differently. So there could be no end to these paraphilias,
well, of
right?
course, I could probably do another A to Z book with lots of different ones. I mean, that's the whole thing. And maybe at one point in the future, I'll do a second volume, because I say this book is an A to Z, not the A to Z. These are things, and that's the great thing about the internet. I couldn't have written this book 20 years ago. I mean, it just couldn't have happened. And in fact, lots of the behaviors I talk about come from information collected from online forums. Now, you briefly mentioned zoophilia before. People who are sexually attracted to animals and want to have sex with animals. I have to be honest, I find that abhorrent. And obviously it's illegal in many different jurisdictions. But in my research, I did go on what was called the Beast Forum. This was an online forum.
Oh, God.
The Beast Forum has over 100,000 members who are posting videos of, can I just say, there are some things you cannot, and I won't mention things.
You can't unsee, right?
Unsee when you've seen them. But what amazed me about the Beast Forum is just the sheer volume of the people on there. As I say, 100,000 plus members on there. Whereas I go to something like the Gassy Forum, where proctophiles meet, and there are, maybe 10 or 12 people who are on there. And that's the thing about, as I say, this book could not have been written 20 years ago, because the internet has meant that if you've got one person who does something that people consider sexually bizarre in one country, the internet provides a way that they can talk to somebody 6,000 miles away who might share that particular behavior. If you've got to remember is, back in the 1970s, the way people would interact is basically through writing mail to each other. Now, of course, with the internet, it's instantaneous. Whatever you're into, you'll find something on the internet. And that's why, I'm often considered one of the kind of forefathers of what we call cyber psychology. I was one of the first people that started researching online behaviors. I talked earlier in the interview about internet addiction. Well, I do find how people's behavior online and how it changes online.
Yes.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
And as I say, the point is that sex online has also changed the way that people view sex and consider sex, because it's a new medium. And as I say, it's that way that people can talk to people or interact with people that ordinarily 20 years ago they just could not have done that. The internet has actually brought that to the fore now.
I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is, to many of us, utterly repugnant. Obviously, things like zoophilia it's beyond.
Yeah.
It's awful, horrendous.
Yeah.
But there are some things in the book which you've already talked about, which are amusing. Okay, they are less problematic. And one example is people who crank their cars and push their pedals. There are fetishes for that, right?
Yeah, there's whole websites, video. I mean, the number of car cranking videos that are online, and pedal pushing, damsel in distress. I mean, in fact, a lot of these actually kind of cross over. You'll notice in the book, I'll talk about one thing and make reference to other things.
Yes.
But it just amazes me, with car cranking fetishes. Of course, it's for it's usually a very attractive. These are male dominated. Pretty woman who are pedal pushing or car cranking, and you can see that again it's like this classically conditioned response, is that you see a beautiful woman sitting on a car, and then you start to associate cars with something sexual, and then there's the subdivision of that, the car cranking, the pedal pushing. Again, it just there's obviously no academic literature on this, but when you go online and find that there's whole video websites of people sharing their car cranking videos or their pedal pushing videos or their damsel in distress videos, whatever. Yeah, and some of them are amusing. And the thing about this, we don't know to what extent people, that this is their main thing in their life, or whether it's just something that is a kind of sexual sideline for them. We have no idea at all, because there's no academic research on it.
It's fascinating. As Flicking points out in the comments, a guy married his car. And again, that's been normalized. We often see, don't we, these people who have apparently married a tree or married a car.
Well, in fact, the most famous one, if you want to go and watch a great video online, is a woman called Sheila Eiffel. She married the Eiffel Tower. So she believes that the Eiffel Tower is her husband. Okay. And there's about 40 objectophiles in the world, or at least that we know of. So these are people that have married, who have sexual relationships with steam engines, bicycles, trains. But the Eiffel Tower, Sheila Eiffel. So there's a whole program out there. You type in Sheila Eiffel TV program. There's a whole documentary on her journey of her basically marrying the Eiffel Tower. Now, yeah, these are rare, and it will raise a smile to some people, but for Sheila Eiffel, she's absolutely in love with her husband, who happens to be the Eiffel Tower. I mean, and again, I mean, a lot of these. I mean, again, in my book, I just describe people having sexual acts with their cars and other things. There's something called mechanophilia, which anything that's having sexual arousal to do with anything that's mechanical can include lots of different things. But there are a number of academic case studies of people that have fallen in love with their cars, or other types of things like bicycles. But as I say, these are all case studies, and that's what interests me. I'm not interested in something like paedophilia, where there's whole libraries. Or what I'm really interested in is the things that people haven't really looked at.
That is what's brilliant about it. Literally brilliant. Lisa, I kind of think I'm going to ask this again, but I do think that we might have answered this, but I'm just going to double check. Lisa says, are paraphilias mainly but not exclusively male dominated? Now, you did touch on that.
Yeah. So basically, most paraphilias are male dominated, but some, there are things. So in the book, I do something called hybristophilia. So people, it's basically people who are attracted to criminal activity, or criminals. So, but this is mostly females who, falling in love with serial killers. Okay. So, that is far more female dominated. The example I just gave you earlier, dacrophilia, seems to be more female dominated than male dominated. But most of the paraphilias that I write about in my books are male based, without a doubt.
Got you. So Awaken says, this fella's on the wind up. This is serious, isn't it, what you're doing here?
Well, I think it's serious. As I say, I'm read my book. It's I'm not like you say, some you will find, let's say, it's the ick factor, some you'll find amusing, but I try and evidence everything that I've done. obviously there are some things I've written about that there's never been an academic paper written about it, but you just go in, type the word that I've looked at online, you'll find online groups out there. You know, there's another, for instance, there is, you know, I'm not a wind up. You know, this isn't a wind up at all. Sorry, I've just seen the thing that's just flashed up on screen. Do people get married to pavements? I've not heard of anybody getting married to pavements, but there is certainly out there a man who was caught fornicating in a pavement. Okay, so not married to a pavement, and I haven't covered pavements in my book.
Lord.
So yeah, so there is. So yeah, as I say, almost anything you can think of, there'll be something out there.
I absolutely, I've very much enjoyed this conversation, Mark. We kept you on slightly longer than I intended to, but thank you so much for being a good sport. Absolutely fascinating, everybody. I will put a link to the book in the description. I've literally never seen anything like it in my entire life. Sexual Perversions and Paraphilias, an A to Z, by Dr. Mark Griffiths and edited by Mike Sutton. Brilliant work. Thank you so much, Mark. Leave us with a parting shot.
Okay, my parting shot. One thing that did make me smile, there's something called clismophilia, which are people who are sexually attracted to enemas. In the book, I've got a lovely example from a genuine case of somebody who went to hospital and had to have a piece of concrete removed from their rectum. Basically, him and his boyfriend were fooling around. This was the quote in the case study. And they basically poured concrete into his partner's rectum, and unfortunately, the concrete set. So I did find this case study really amusing. Might be too much information at this time in the morning, but yeah, there are lots of little things in the book. So that's my parting shot for you today, Sonia.
Well, thank you. We very much enjoyed it. Literally, I think you've inspired a whole live chat to come up with all manner of things. Thank you so much, says Kat, and so say all of us, everybody. Dr. Mark Griffiths, what a joy. Thank you, Mark. Have a brilliant weekend. Take good care of yourself. Absolutely. Brilliant. Of course, I love, me, people. I love something a bit different, right? Hi, people, says me. Hi, me. You've just come in at the end of a paraphilia talk.